The questions to guide this lecture are going to be: what makes something true, what makes us think that something's true, and why and how do people speak and act contrary to the truth. So this is going to be a bit of a dive into kind of moral philosophy and epistemology. There'll also fit a bit of social and political theory in when I talk about why people are untruthful or even just indifferent to the truth. I'm going to start by talking about three different theories of truth, which are actually explained kind of in greater detail in a lecture that I'll link to in the video description down below. But each of these theories is a different response to the question, what makes something true? And we can also kind of repurpose each theory to help explain why people might think something is true, even when arguably from a different perspective that something is false. First, we have the correspondence theory of truth. That is, a claim is true if it corresponds to the reality of the world. So if I say I'm wearing sunglasses right now, that is untrue because observably I'm not. This is probably the version of truth that we're most familiar with, and the naive empiricists, the naive realists who we've talked about before, would kind of like for every claim to be so straightforwardly testable. But really, once we get past the realm of really simple, concrete claims about objects in a room that we can actually see, the correspondence theory actually becomes a bit shakier. If I make a statement like, for example, authoritarianism is on the rise in Turkey, that's not so straightforwardly testable as I'm wearing sunglasses. Authoritarian isn't some physical object hovering in the air somewhere above Ankara whose downward or upward movement we can measure, right? It's kind of an abstraction. And the more abstract and general a claim is, the less we can rely on a simple theory of correspondence alone. Stuart Hall, whom I discussed in my previous lecture, has already given us one reason why this is the case, right? Why correspondence theory isn't enough. Objects in the world, and for that matter, words themselves as cultural objects, never have a singular fixed meaning, and our interpretations of what objects or words or events mean are conditioned by what we already think we know about the world. I can certainly muster empirical evidence to show that my claim corresponds to reality. My claim that authoritarianism is on the rise in Turkey, right? I can point to new laws passed, to instances of the Turkish president's political opponents getting thrown in jail, and so on. But it's always possible for the person I'm trying to convince to interpret that evidence in a different way than me, to select their own evidence that they think supports a contradictory general claim about the direction that Turkey's political system is moving. Or they could define authoritarianism different than me, or define Turkey, for that matter, differently than me. So this very straightforward empiricist correspondence theory can't solve all our disagreements about what is true when it comes to a lot of political and social issues that we care about the most. The theory of truth that seems a bit better at accounting for more abstract general propositions is coherence theory. According to the coherence theory of truth, something is true when it fits in with, that is, it coheres to, other things that are also true. This is the way that mathematical proofs are true, for example. They can be talking about abstractions, right, just numbers, but they build logically on what has already been proven to be true, what mathematicians already know, and thus they can reach new truths in that way. In the real world, I think in a lot of cases, we actually tend to rely on kind of a combination of correspondence and coherence theory to evaluate the truthfulness of claims. So let's say we want to evaluate the truthfulness of the claim that Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939. Following correspondence theory, we can look to try to find an actual concrete event that was observable at a particular place and time. So in this case, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain at number 10 Downing Street, sitting in front of a microphone saying, this country is at war with Germany. That would be kind of the observable thing that corresponds to reality that we can point to. But we still do need coherence theory. We still have to interpret the meaning of a guy sitting in a room saying something in terms of what we already know or assume to be true. We have to assume, right, that Britain and Germany are sovereign political entities, that Britain is ruled by a prime minister with the authority to declare war, and so on. The claim that Britain just declared war on Germany depends on the fit of that particular evidence, let's say an audio recording of Chamberlain's announcement, with everything else we know or think we know about the world. If some random person sitting in their house stated that East Anglia was declaring war on Bavaria, it wouldn't have the same truth status, right? It would still be something, an event that we could point to that corresponds to reality, to say this happened, but it doesn't cohere to what else we know about the way the world works, right? Those weren't, East Anglia and Bavaria weren't recognized sovereign political units in the world in 1939, and a random person didn't have the authority to declare war. So the claim that East Anglia declared war on Bavaria would be incoherent with respect to what else we know about the world. Okay, so we have correspondence, we have coherence, and then there's the pragmatic theory of truth. Pragmatism in the philosophical sense, in the epistemological sense, goes basically like this. A claim is true when it's useful, when it accomplishes something successfully in the world and can't be defeated, can't be falsified by evidence or reasoning. So, for example, when I said that there was a link to another video about the philosophy of truth down in the description to this video, that was true in the pragmatic sense because by following my statement, by assuming it to be true, you could find that other video. Claiming that I'm wearing sunglasses is false because when I go outside, the sun is going to hurt my eyes. Right? That's not a useful claim. This might seem like the same thing as correspondence, but it's not exactly. We see this when, for example, we look at the truthfulness of science. If we think about the truthfulness of science. So, for example, Newtonian physics, the classic mechanical theory of the physical world, which was probably the basis for most of the physics work that you did in school, most of the equations you learned in physics class, has actually kind of been blown out of the sky. Einstein and his successors have showed over the past century that Isaac Newton's claims about how the world works actually don't correspond to the reality of the universe. So there's been a paradigm shift, and the Newtonian model is no longer considered true by the criteria of correspondence. Yet it's still taught everywhere in high schools and junior high schools. Why is that? Well, Newton's theories were and still are actually incredibly useful for a lot of purposes. We couldn't have developed aircraft without Newtonian physics. And because Newton's theories were good enough claims about the universe to be useful to us, they were more truthful from a pragmatic perspective than, say, Aristotelian physics or other kinds of models being proposed back in the 17th century when Isaac Newton lived for how the universe works. For that matter, Einstein's theory of relativity also probably doesn't actually correspond to the universe, and in fact it's incompatible with the current theory of quantum mechanics that's being kind of assumed to be true or being used as if it were true today. So the two theories, relativity and quantum mechanics, actually fail the coherence test for truth when put together. But nonetheless, physicists currently rely on both of those theories, even though put together they form an incoherent worldview. The theory of relativity passes the pragmatic truth test because it's useful. For example, factoring in relativity is what allows GPS to work and other kinds of satellite-based measurements. Now, that's good and fine for physics and getting planes to fly and satellites to measure things, but one of the big critiques of pragmatism, particularly as applied to kind of the social world, social science, and claims made by journalists and politicians and so on, one of the big critiques of pragmatism is that the theory can't distinguish between truth and a successful lie. So let's say I'm a politician, and I make the claim that people of different races are inherently opposed to each other and can never peacefully coexist. Well, that claim might be successful, right? It might be effective in that it makes people distrust their neighbors who have different skin tones than them. And so it might make it so that actually, as a result of my, whipping up racism, people are finding it more difficult to coexist. And, also maybe as a side benefit, people vote for me. That's another way, right, in which my speech can be effective, useful. Or, maybe instead I claim that Marx's theories are true and society can be boiled down to a struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And let's say I stage a revolution based on that claim, and maybe I'm even successful and I create a communist workers' utopia. Even so, is that claim, are these claims, whether the Marxist one or the racist ones, are claims like these, which kind of create a reality rather than describing it, true in the same way as the statement, I'm not wearing glasses? Are they true in the same way? Because they're both useful? And this idea of usefulness, of course, also begs the question, useful for whom and useful to what end? Now, speaking of the dark side, if you will, the dark side of each of these theories of truth, each of these three theories, each of these criteria for assessing truthfulness have kind of an evil twin. And it's important to note that the criteria I've laid out aren't just used by philosophers in their ivory tower to determine truth. No, philosophers are saying that these, right, correspondence, coherence, and pragmatism, are actually the bases on which all of us, moving around through the world every day, are assessing the truthfulness of claims. And for that reason, because we're constantly relying on them, correspondence, coherence, and pragmatism can each serve as the basis for a false belief as well. With correspondence theory, this is pretty straightforward, right? You can get somebody to believe something by faking evidence that it happened. So think photoshopped images, deep-faked videos, audio recordings placed together in a misleading way. Fakery that people believe because they think they're observing reality. But that kind of simple form of fakery isn't actually the most common or necessarily the most convincing basis of untruthfulness, at least not by itself. Again, often we see people evaluating claims according to both correspondence and coherence, kind of in tandem. And so, for instance, we often see that people are willing to believe a Photoshop job, or that gatekeepers in journalism, reporters and editors, will publish information without a thorough enough fact check when it coheres to what they already think they know about the world. This is something that gatekeeping theorists talk about when they discuss second guessing in the newsmaking process, right? That news gatekeepers are more likely to second guess. They're more likely to really interrogate something, doubt a claim, make sure that an image is authentic if it doesn't cohere to what they already think they know about the world. So if something is designed, if a photoshopped image is created and sent to them that doesn't violate their pre-existing notions, their expectations about the world, then they're less likely to second guess it. They're more likely to let it pass through their gate. You can get people to believe a lie much more easily if it makes sense, right? Based on their pre-existing beliefs. And this is going to come up over and over again when we talk about propaganda. Jacques Ellul in particular is going to argue that really successful propaganda isn't just about a lie here or there, but about creating a coherent and widely shared system of belief with a lot of different parts that fit together. Hannah Arendt also is going to touch on these ideas in her discussion of modern political lies, which will be the subject of the last part of this lecture. The importance of coherence for people's evaluations of truthfulness is a big part of why it can be so difficult to argue with somebody who's really gone deep into conspiracy theory thinking. Some of you may have had this experience on social media, or maybe at the family dinner table or at Thanksgiving arguing with the uncle. So maybe a friend or a relative posts on social media one particular specific claim that you think is ridiculous. You tell them so, and maybe you paste in a link to some contradictory evidence or to a fact-checking website or a news article that's debunked their claim, but it almost never works. You can argue about that one particular claim in terms of correspondence to reality, but the problem is that they've bought into a whole internally coherent paradigm, a set of mutually reinforcing beliefs and interpretations that makes their claim, that particular claim, seem obvious to them and makes your counterclaim seem naive or dishonest. Whatever the strength of the empirical evidence of your claim versus their claim. Because empirical evidence can never stand alone, right? It can almost never stand alone, right? At least not be on the level of, like, I'm wearing sunglasses. Interpretation is almost always a part of the debate. When it comes to the kind of evil twin of pragmatist theory of truth, of a pragmatist epistemology, we very often find people acting pragmatically in the colloquial sense and in kind of the very cynical sense of claiming or choosing to believe whatever is most expedient to them, whatever serves their interest, regardless of correspondence to the reality of the world, maybe even regardless of coherence with their other claims. So often this involves kind of jettisoning a key provision of pragmatism as a theory of truth, which is that a statement should not only be useful, but should also not be defeatable by evidence or logic. So instead, kind of the evil twin pragmatist just says whatever works to achieve some goal without rigorously subjecting it to counter evidence or to rational interrogation. Instead, the kind of evil twin pragmatist really just assesses the validity of claims based on whether they advance the pragmatist's own interests. This is the way Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels said that politicians should assess their propaganda efforts. So to quote Goebbels, that propaganda is good, that has the desired results, and that propaganda is bad, that does not lead to the desired results. It does not matter how clever it is, for the task of propaganda is not to be clever. Its task is to lead to success. I therefore avoid theoretical discussions about propaganda, for there is no point to it. Propaganda shows that it is good if over a certain period it can win over and fire up people for an idea. If it fails to do so, it is bad propaganda. If propaganda wins the people it wanted to win, it was presumably good, and if not, it was presumably bad. We're going to come across a number of thinkers who consider this kind of political pragmatism in the sense of indifference to anything except for power, to be central to 20th and 21st century political discourse. And this kind of propagandistic pragmatism is, I think, very much what gives rise to what philosopher Harry Frankfurt calls bullshit, which I'm going to discuss next.